The stubbornness of a dog that refuses to leave a grave leads the police to investigate, uncovering a dangerous secret that leaves everyone paralyzed with fear. "Why is that dog still there?" London asked quietly as she watched Duke, the dog that hadn't moved from that grave at Bonaventure Cemetery for days. From a distance, the young woman could see how Duke stayed still, his eyes fixed on the headstone. "It's like he's guarding something or someone," she thought. London had been visiting the cemetery almost every day that week. She was always met with the same scene: Duke, alone, vigilant. The locals started to whisper about the dog's strange behavior. Some believed Duke was waiting for someone to come back, while others said maybe it was the spirit of the deceased keeping him there. The truth was, nobody knew for sure. "This isn't normal," London said to herself, finally deciding to do something about it. She walked quickly to the small office of Levi, the cemetery caretaker. He was an older man with graying hair, always wearing a worn-out baseball cap, and knew every corner of the cemetery like the back of his hand. When he saw her arrive, he greeted her with a smile, but his expression changed when he noticed the worry on the young woman's face. "Levi, I need to talk to you about Duke," London said bluntly. Levi's face tightened. "The dog? Yeah, I've heard he won't move from that grave," he said as he settled into an old wooden chair. "It's strange. I've always seen him running around here playing or looking for food, but now, it's like he's on a mission." London nodded. "It's just, I don't know. There's something about that grave that doesn't feel right. Duke won't let anyone get close. I saw him barking and baring his teeth when a man tried to place flowers on the grave next to it." Levi frowned. "Which grave exactly are you talking about?" "Dominic's, that one. The man who died in that fire a few months ago," London said, a chill running down her spine. Levi got up from his chair and grabbed his cap. "Well, we'd better take a closer look. We can't let this go on without figuring it out." The two walked in silence toward Dominic's grave. The cemetery was almost deserted, except for Duke, who remained in place, loyal and unmovable. When they arrived, Duke lifted his head, and his dark eyes glistened under the dim afternoon sun. The dog didn't bark, but his stance was clear. He wasn't going to let anyone get close. Levi watched the animal for a few moments before sighing. "This isn't normal, London. I'm going to call the police. Maybe they can help us understand what's going on." London looked at Duke, who still wouldn't take his eyes off the grave. "Do you think there's something in there?" she asked quietly, even though the answer she was hoping for wouldn't ease her mind. Levi shrugged. "I don't know, but we can't keep going like this. Something's off here." A couple of hours later, the sound of sirens broke the solemn silence of the cemetery. 2 patrol cars parked near the entrance, and 3 officers stepped out of the vehicles. The officer in charge, a tall man with graying hair, looked at Duke from a distance, his gaze calculating. He knew that in his years of service, he had seen many strange things, but something about this scene made his skin crawl. He had learned to trust his instincts, and his instincts told him this wasn't an ordinary case. "It's the dog," Levi pointed out, gesturing toward Duke. "He hasn't let anyone near the grave for days." The officer approached slowly, trying not to scare the animal. Duke began to growl, low but threatening, his dark eyes locked on the group approaching him. One of the younger officers pulled out a flashlight, even though the sun was still weakly lighting the area. "Easy, boy," said the older officer, raising his hands in a calming gesture. But Duke didn't back down. He wasn't going to let anyone touch that grave. "We're going to need someone to handle him," muttered the younger officer. "That dog won't let us get close." The older officer nodded. "I'm going to call a specialist. Meanwhile, make sure no one else approaches. This might be bigger than it seems." London watched everything from a distance, her heart racing. She knew Duke was trying to protect something, but the fear of the unknown was starting to take over her. What would they find once they opened that grave? Would Dominic's body be there? Or worse, would it be empty? The whispers began to spread among the townspeople, who started gathering curiously at the cemetery. Everyone wanted to know what was happening, what could be in Dominic's grave that had the dog in such a protective state. Hours later, with the sunlight almost gone, the animal behavior specialist arrived at the cemetery. He was a middle-aged man, his face weathered from years of dealing with difficult animals. He watched Duke for a few minutes before slowly approaching, speaking in a low voice. "He's guarding something," he finally said, his tone serious. "This dog knows something's wrong, and he's not going to move until it's found out." The senior officer nodded, and after consulting with the rest of the team, they made a decision. They were going to open the grave. Permission had already been granted, and now all eyes were on what would be revealed beneath the earth. With tools in hand, the workers began to dig. Duke watched from a safe distance, growling every now and then, but not attacking. The air was thick with tension. The few neighbors who had stayed this late watched in silence, whispering among themselves, while London and Levi kept their eyes fixed on the process. Finally, after what felt like hours of work, there was the sound of the shovel hitting something solid. They had reached the coffin. The murmurs grew louder, and a chill ran down everyone's spine. "Let's open it," said the senior officer, his voice firm but with a hint of hesitation. When they finally lifted the lid of the coffin, the silence was deafening. No one could believe what they were seeing. The coffin was empty. Only some old blankets lay inside, dusty and worn with age. A murmur of disbelief spread through the crowd. "Where's the body?" someone asked out loud, breaking the tension of the moment. London took a step back, her heart in her throat. Dominic's body wasn't there. Everything they thought they knew about his death was unraveling before their eyes. Duke, who had been so agitated during the whole process, calmly sat down next to the grave, as if he knew his job was done. Or maybe it had just begun. The officers exchanged glances, clearly puzzled. "We need to investigate this further," said the senior officer, his tone grave. "This isn't what we expected." London, her mind spinning, felt a terrible truth beginning to surface. If Dominic's body wasn't in the grave, then what had really happened to him? Duke, the loyal dog, slowly got up and walked over to London as if seeking comfort. She crouched down, stroking his head, and whispered, "You knew something was wrong, didn't you, Duke?" The dog looked up at her, his eyes reflecting something London couldn't quite understand. But she knew the mystery was only beginning to unfold. The next day, the police returned to the cemetery, this time with a clearer mission. The investigation into Dominic had revealed something disturbing. His cell phone had been used after his supposed death. That opened a new path for the investigation, one that suggested Dominic might not be dead, as everyone had believed. "It's very strange," one of the officers said while checking the dates on the case file. "The phone usage matches the day after his funeral. But then, who was using it?" The younger officer, who had been at the cemetery the previous day, looked at the file with a raised eyebrow. "What if he's not dead? What if Dominic is still alive somewhere?" "It's a possibility," his superior replied, crossing his arms. "But we need proof. We're going to track those phone movements and see if they lead us anywhere." While the police were following the electronic trails, things were no less tense at Gabriella's house. Carlos, her husband, had been acting very strange over the past few months. He avoided talking about their son's death, and when he did, his tone was cold, distant. Gabriella noticed it, but she had never wanted to confront him directly. Losing a child could destroy any family, and maybe he was just coping with his pain in a different way. Yet, something inside her wouldn't let it go. The nights when Carlos disappeared without explanation, the late-night calls he quickly hung up when she walked into the room. All of it was starting to form a puzzle that deeply unsettled her. One night, while Carlos was asleep, Gabriella quietly got up and walked to her husband's study. The door was slightly ajar, as if he had left in a hurry. Inside, everything was dark, except for the glow of his phone on the table. Gabriella, her heart racing, approached and saw that there was a recent call in the history. The number wasn't saved, just a set of digits she didn't recognize. "Who are you talking to, Carlos?" Gabriella whispered to herself as she walked away from the study, feeling something crumble inside her. Days went by, and the investigation into Dominic's case was getting more confusing. The police had discovered that the calls made from his phone were to unknown numbers, and some of those numbers were traced to a remote area outside the town. But the strangest thing was that the timing of the calls seemed to match up with the times Carlos disappeared from the house. When Gabriella found this out, she had to face a truth she had been avoiding for a long time. Her husband was hiding something from her. She decided to go to the police. She couldn't keep ignoring the signs, and if there was even a slight chance that her son was still alive, she had to do everything she could to find out the truth. The officer in charge met her at the station, listening carefully to every word she said. When she finished talking, he nodded slowly. "Mrs. Gabriella, we're going to take a closer look at your husband's movements. We might have more questions in the next few days." Gabriella felt both relieved and terrified. If Carlos was involved in something related to their son's disappearance, how could she face that reality? But she didn't have time to dwell on those thoughts. Her priority was Dominic. If there was any chance her son was alive, she had to keep going, no matter the consequences. That morning, the police came back with more news. The officer in charge, an older man with a face worn from years of service, explained to Gabriella what they had discovered over the last few days. "Mrs. Gabriella, we've been following the leads from your son's phone, and everything points to a drug trafficking network that Carlos seems to be connected to," he said in a serious tone, almost as if he was apologizing for what he was about to say next. "We know that Dominic found out something he wasn't supposed to, and that put him in a very dangerous position." Gabriella felt her heart tighten. The air felt heavy in her lungs, and her hands began to tremble slightly. "What did my son find out?" she asked, her voice barely audible, fearing the answer. "Dominic found out that his father was involved in drug trafficking. From what we've gathered in his journal, Dominic was horrified by the situation and was planning to confront him to make him stop. That was the day before he disappeared," the officer explained, pausing for a moment to choose his words carefully. Gabriella clenched her fists on the table, feeling a mix of anger and sadness welling up inside her. Her son had been so close to danger, and she hadn't been able to protect him. "Why didn't he ever tell me?" she whispered to herself. "Dominic, why didn't you tell me?" The officer sighed and continued. "Dominic probably didn't want to involve you, Ma'am. He knew he was up against something big. In fact, it seems that what put him at even greater risk was that Carlos's clients found out he knew too much." Gabriella looked up, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "What are you telling me?" she asked, a mix of disbelief and fear in her voice. "Your husband's clients ordered him to kill Dominic," the officer said firmly, but Carlos couldn't do it. Instead, he decided to hide him. He kept him in a house outside of town, hoping that would be enough to protect him. Gabriella was silent, her mind trying to process the enormity of what she had just heard. Carlos had kidnapped his own son to save his life. The contradiction of that reality was unbearable. How could he have sunk so low? That night, Gabriella decided she couldn't keep waiting any longer. She couldn't just sit around while the police did their work. She needed answers, and she needed them now. Carlos had been avoiding the police in recent days, shutting himself off more and more, and Gabriella knew that if she didn't act soon, it might be too late to get the whole truth. She walked to her husband's office, a small room at the back of the house where Carlos had spent most of his nights since Dominic disappeared. She knocked softly on the door but didn't wait for an answer. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. Carlos was sitting behind the desk, staring out the window. His face was shrouded in shadows, and Gabriella couldn't help but notice how much he had aged in the past few weeks. He looked like a defeated man, but she couldn't feel sorry for him, not after what she had found out. "I need to talk to you," Gabriella said, her voice firmer than she felt inside. Carlos didn't move at first, but then he sighed and slowly turned in his chair to face her. "You know everything, don't you?" he said quietly. "I do," Gabriella answered, stepping closer. "I know you're involved in drug trafficking. I know our income, our life. All of it is tainted by what you've done. And I know you kidnapped Dominic." Carlos closed his eyes for a moment, as if the words had hit him, physically. "I didn't have a choice," he finally said, his voice broken. "I couldn't kill him, but I couldn't let them find him either. He knew too much." "He was your son, Carlos," Gabriella shouted, tears now streaming freely down her face. "Our son! How could you do this to him? How could you do this to us?" Carlos didn't respond right away. Instead, he slowly got up from his chair and walked over to the window, staring out into the darkness outside. "I didn't expect you to understand," he murmured. "There's no excuse for what I did. But all I was trying to do was protect him. I couldn't let them kill him." Gabriella looked at him, feeling a mix of rage and despair. Protect him? By kidnapping him? By keeping him hidden while we all thought he was dead? Carlos clenched his fists, unable to face his wife. It was the only way. The only way to keep him alive. Gabriella couldn't stand to hear any more. She took a step back, her breathing ragged and her mind clouded with pain. "You've taken everything from me, Carlos," she said quietly. "You destroyed us. You destroyed our family. I don't know how I'll ever move on from this." "I know," Carlos whispered, finally facing her with tears in his eyes. "I know." At the cemetery, Duke continued his vigil by the empty grave, as if he understood that the end of this dark chapter was still yet to come. The town's children kept visiting him, but Duke barely paid attention to their petting. His eyes remained fixed on an invisible point, waiting for something only he seemed to know. The sun had barely risen when Gabriella received the call she had been waiting for weeks. The officer in charge, speaking in a low, measured voice, told her they had found the exact location of the house where Dominic was being held. The rescue operation would begin that very afternoon, and Gabriella wasn't willing to sit back while her son's fate was decided. She wanted to be there. She needed to see it with her own eyes. "I want to go with you," Gabriella insisted to the officer. Her voice shook with emotion and fear, but there was an unbreakable firmness in her tone. She knew it wouldn't be easy to convince them, but she also knew she couldn't endure another wait, another moment of uncertainty. The officer sighed on the other end of the line. "Ma'am, I understand how you feel, but it's dangerous. This operation is not a game." Gabriella closed her eyes, trying to hold back her tears. "He's my son. I've spent months believing he was dead. I can't stay here while you rescue him. I need to be there." There was a long pause. Finally, the officer agreed, though with some hesitation. "You can come, but you'll have to stay back until we're sure it's safe to approach. I don't want to take any unnecessary risks." Gabriella agreed. It was all she needed. To be close. To be there to hold her son as soon as possible. The afternoon arrived, heavy with tension. The air in Gabriella's house was thick, filled with anticipation and fear. Duke, the loyal dog who had kept watch by the empty grave, seemed to sense his owner's nervousness. His dark eyes stayed alert, and he didn't leave her side for even a second. When the police cars arrived to pick her up, Duke jumped into the vehicle next to Gabriella without hesitation, as if he understood that this mission wouldn't be complete without him. The officers exchanged glances, surprised by the dog's loyalty, but they didn't say anything. By now, Duke had become a key figure in this story. The convoy of vehicles made its way along the dusty roads outside the town, heading toward a remote area filled with dry fields and abandoned houses. With each mile they travelled, Gabriella's heart beat faster. Her hands, clenched tightly on her lap, wouldn't stop trembling, but her eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. Duke, sitting next to her, rested his head on her legs, as if trying to calm her with his presence. Finally, they arrived at an old house, its walls cracked and windows covered in dust. It was clear it hadn't been inhabited for years, at least not legally. The police team quickly deployed, weapons in hand and movements precise. The tension was so thick it could be cut with a knife. "Stay here," the officer instructed Gabriella, pointing to the vehicle. "Wait until we give the signal that it's safe." Gabriella nodded, though every fibre of her being wanted to run toward the house. Duke, by her side, let out a low growl, as if he too sensed the danger looming over them. The minutes that followed felt like an eternity. The sound of hurried footsteps from the officers, the creaking of the door being forced open, the muffled shouts coming from inside. It all seemed blurry to Gabriella. Her mind was focused on just one thing: Dominic. Suddenly, one of the officers came out of the house, waving his hand to signal that the area was secure. Gabriella didn't wait any longer. With her heart in her throat, she got out of the vehicle and ran to the entrance, with Duke right by her side. Inside the house, the atmosphere was even gloomier. The light barely seeped through the old, dusty curtains, and the air smelled of dampness and neglect. But Gabriella didn't see any of that. Her eyes were only on the figure in the darkest corner of the room. Dominic. Her son was there, sitting on the floor, his hands tied, his face pale and gaunt, but alive. Dominic's eyes, though tired, lit up when he saw his mother. Gabriella fell to her knees in front of him, breaking down in tears as she cut the ropes that kept him prisoner. Her hands trembled, but she finally managed to free him. "Dominic, my boy, you're alive," she whispered through sobs, hugging him tightly. It was as if the months of pain and anguish melted away in that instant. All that mattered now was that her son was there, with her. Dominic, weakened, could barely return the hug, but his eyes filled with tears as he murmured, "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry." Gabriella kissed him on the forehead, unable to stop crying. "You don't have to apologize for anything. You're here. That's all that matters." Duke, who had been watching from the doorway, finally approached. The dog rushed to Dominic, wagging his tail with renewed energy. Dominic smiled weakly as he stroked the head of the loyal companion who had never abandoned him. "Duke, I knew you wouldn't leave me," Dominic whispered, his voice barely audible but full of gratitude. The days following Dominic's rescue were slow and heavy, as if time had stopped at that point in Gabriella and her son's life. Even though Dominic was back home, the shadow of what had happened loomed over them. The whispers in town grew like wind before a storm, and everyone knew what had happened. Carlos's name was on every corner, in every murmur. Gabriella tried to stay calm, but the pain of betrayal still sat in her chest like an open wound. How could he have done it? Carlos hadn't just put Dominic's life at risk, he had shattered the trust and love that had once united them as a family. Every day, when she saw Dominic walking around the house, thinner, with his eyes lost in some distant corner, she felt like she could never forgive her husband, even if she wanted to. The town had showered Duke with praise. The dog, always faithful, had become a local hero. The children called him Dominic's savior, and families would come by Gabriella's house just to see him. Duke, however, remained the same. Quiet, vigilant. He seemed to understand that even though the most dangerous part was over, the calm hadn't fully returned. Duke followed Dominic everywhere, like a tireless guardian, his loyalty stronger than ever. One day, as the sun set on the horizon, Gabriella and Dominic sat on the porch. The air was cool, and Duke rested at Dominic's feet, always alert. "Mum, how did all this happen?" Dominic asked softly, his eyes fixed on the sky. He had spent weeks trying to process everything he had discovered about his father, but the pain was still there, deep and constant. Gabriella sighed. There wasn't an easy answer to that question. I don't know, son. Sometimes people do terrible things when they're caught in situations they can't control. But what your dad did, there's no excuse for it. Dominic nodded slowly, but didn't say anything more. The silence between them was heavy, but not uncomfortable. They both understood that words couldn't always ease what was felt in the heart. In the days that followed, the police continued to investigate Carlos's connections to drug trafficking. Even though he was now behind bars, his name still echoed in conversations around town. Many couldn't believe that such a respected man could have done something so vile. Others, however, said they had always suspected something was off. But regardless of what people thought, for Gabriella and Dominic, Carlos was no longer the man they remembered. The image they had of him was shattered forever. One afternoon, Gabriella ran into a neighbor at the town store. The man, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and with a compassionate look, patted her on the shoulder. "Mrs. Gabriella, I'm so sorry for everything that's happened. This town isn't the same without Mr. Carlos, but you're strong. You're going to get through this." Gabriella smiled faintly, appreciating the gesture. "Thank you, but I'm not the same either. The only thing that matters to me now is that my son is alive." The neighbor nodded, and then, glancing over to where Duke was, added, "That dog is a blessing. If it weren't for him, we might never have discovered the truth." Gabriella looked at Duke, who was patiently waiting for her at the store's entrance. Yes, Duke has been our salvation in so many ways. One afternoon, after coming back from town, Dominic sat in the backyard, with Duke lying at his feet. Gabriella, watching them from the kitchen window, felt a mix of pride and sadness. Her son had gone through a trial that no young person should have to face, and even though the pain was still there, she could see that Dominic was starting to heal. The nights, however, were still difficult. She often heard him getting up in the early hours, walking around the house, searching for some relief from the chaos in his mind. Gabriella dried her hands on her apron and went out to the patio, sitting down next to Dominic. The cool evening breeze surrounded them, and for a moment, neither of them said a word. It was a comfortable silence, as if they both knew that words weren't needed. "How are you feeling today, son?" Gabriella finally asked, breaking the silence with a gentle voice. Dominic looked toward the horizon, where the sun was beginning to set behind the hills. "Better, I think," he replied, though his tone wasn't entirely convincing. "Some days feel easier, but others." He paused, searching for the right words. "I still think about everything that happened, about what I found out about Dad. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forget it." Gabriella placed a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to forget, Dominic. The past will always be there, but it doesn't have to define who you are or how you live your life. What matters is that you keep moving forward and don't let the pain control you." Dominic nodded slowly. He knew his mother was right, but letting go of the resentment and sadness wasn't easy. Duke, as if sensing the weight of the conversation, lifted his head and looked at Dominic with dark, understanding eyes. As the days went by, life began to find a different rhythm. Gabriella decided it was time to make some changes. The house that she had once shared with Carlos no longer felt like a complete home. Everything there reminded her of her husband, of the betrayal, of the secrets that had torn their family apart. She knew she couldn't just erase what happened, but she also knew that staying in that place, surrounded by those memories, wouldn't help her or Dominic. One Sunday morning, while they were having breakfast, Gabriella spoke to her son about the possibility of moving. "Dominic, I've been thinking," she began cautiously. "Maybe it would be good for us to move. This place, It's full of memories, and not all of them are good. Dominic looked at her for a moment, surprised. He had never imagined leaving that house, the place where he had grown up, but he understood what his mother meant. He had felt that same heaviness, as if the walls carried the weight of everything that had happened. "Maybe you're right, Mom," he replied thoughtfully. "Maybe we need a fresh start, a place where we can breathe again." The decision wasn't easy, but little by little they started making preparations to leave the house behind. Duke, as always, followed them every step of the way, silently watching as Gabriella packed up their belongings and Dominic said goodbye to the corners of his childhood. On the day of the move, the neighbors gathered to help, as was the custom in town. Every box loaded onto the truck was a small step toward closing a painful chapter. As the last piece of furniture was loaded, Gabriella took one last look at the house. The memories, both good and bad, flooded her mind, but this time they didn't overwhelm her. She knew that leaving this place wouldn't erase what had happened, but she also knew it was the beginning of something new for her family. "We're ready," she said, looking at Dominic, who stood beside Duke. Dominic smiled faintly. "Yeah, I think we are." Duke wagged his tail, as if he too understood that a new life was about to begin. Gabriella and Dominic's new home was smaller, but cozier. It was located on the outskirts of town, surrounded by fields and trees, far from the dark memories they had left behind. The peace of the place allowed them to heal, little by little. Although the shadow of Carlos still lingered over them, it no longer controlled them. Every day was an opportunity to rebuild, to redefine their future. Duke, as always, remained a vital part of this new life. His watchful eyes and unwavering loyalty had become a symbol of hope for both of them. With him by their side, Gabriella and Dominic knew they could face anything. The days grew longer, and the nights began to feel less heavy. Life, though marked by the past, continued with the promise of a better tomorrow. Gabriella and Dominic had finally found a bit of peace. And with Duke as their loyal companion, they knew that no matter what, they would always be together, ready for whatever fate had in store for them. The story of Gabriella, Dominic, and Duke is a touching journey of pain, betrayal, and, ultimately, healing. Throughout the narrative, we see how Dominic confronts not only the physical and emotional trauma of being kidnapped, but also the devastating discovery that his own father, Carlos, was involved in crimes that nearly destroyed their family. However, the bond between Dominic and Duke, his loyal dog, is what truly brings hope and strength to this story. Duke is not just a pet. He is a protector, an unwavering friend who, without saying a word, stands by his owner during the darkest moments. His loyalty and constant presence reflect the depth of the connection between humans and animals, showing how a simple being can offer invaluable emotional support. The story reminds us of the power of love, trust, and loyalty. In times of crisis, when human bonds are broken, it's often in our animal companions that we find comfort and the strength to keep going. Duke symbolizes the kind of pure, selfless love that can help heal even the deepest wounds. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share it. Leave a comment to tell us how it inspired you. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel. May God bless you and guide you every step of the way.